Tensura. Of Bonds and Demon Lords by Ryagful. Rimuru managed to drag his eyes away from the demon lord who had just turned the great Charybdis into nothing, looking down to the person that was largely responsible for the whole mess. Great Sage, what do you say? Answer. Fusion rate of individual Phobio and individual Charybdis is over 90%. It will take less than an hour for Charybdis to return to full power and reform. GS informed him. Milam saw him scowl and asked, what's up? If we leave him here, the monster will just come back. I've got to separate Charybdis from Phobio. Can you do something like that? Even if you do, won't it just go somewhere else and start over? She asked with some worry. She wasn't wrong. As a spiritual being, Charybdis, once separated from its host, would vanish and reform in another place. Even so, he had a plan. He looked back up at her and offered a reassuring smile. Yeah, no worries. I got this, all right. Great Sage, we can do this, he told his partner as he placed both hands on Phobio's chest. Parallel activation of Degenerate and Gluttony. You control the power, I'll handle the rest. Understood, Great Sage replied. A black mist enveloped the Beastman. Degenerate, a power he had gotten from absorbing Shizu, was capable of separating or merging powers, and as a spiritual life form Charybdis was vulnerable to its use. Once its core was separated from Phobio, he absorbed it with Gluttony and quickly put it into his storage space where it would have no escape. Eventually, it would be disassembled, vanishing into nothing. The process took only a few seconds, but it was far from simple and he felt exhausted afterwards, falling backwards to sit down. Milam watched the process with starry eyes and sat down beside him once it was over. How did it go? He gave her a thumbs up. All done, it was a success. The two stood there in silence a few minutes, alone, while the rest of the troops made their way to where they were. Milam looked like she wanted to say something, but didn't. She was fidgeting a bit, but he really couldn't place why. Well, he'd ask later once everything settled down. He too had some things to say to her, but decided to do so later. Watching her completely annihilate Charybdis within seconds while they barely made a dent in 10 hours really made him realize just how far apart they were in terms of not just power ranking, but in general. She was a demon lord, someone at the pinnacle of the world. If she wanted to, she could probably very easily take everything she could ever possibly want by force. That she didn't made him realize she may not be as selfish, inconsiderate or irresponsible as he first believed her to be. Their attention was distracted by the sound of footsteps. Behind them, Benimaru and a few of the others were fast approaching. After reassuring them everything was over, he filled them in on what Milam had done. They were slack-jawed to say the least. Unbelievable, was all Sheehan could muster, but I would expect nothing less. A cheer rang out from the troops at their victory. Milam for her part really seemed to enjoy the compliments. URG. Rimuru turned his attention to the sound, realizing it was Phobio. His eyes were slowly opening, and he looked like in a daze. When he set his eyes on him and Milam, however, his eyes shot wide open in realization. He immediately and painfully, by what he could tell, shot up and got on his hands and knees, prostrating himself before them. I am sorry. He shouted, I humbly apologize. Rimuru could feel the sincerity in them. Whatever happened to get him possessed by Charybdis, Rimuru figured it gave Phobio a real dose of humility. All of this I did on my own, Lord Carrion had nothing to do with it. He hastily added, if you want vengeance, take it with my life alone, please, he begged. Rimuru considered how to properly respond. I didn't have Milam spare you just to kill you afterwards, you know, he told the man. Hearing that, Phobio cast a quick glance at Milam, shocked, then looked back down in shame. I do however want you to answer some questions. Trainee. At the sound of her name, the dryad in question materialized nearby. He had sensed her coming while they were talking. Yes, thank you, she said with a small bow to Rimuru, then turned her attention on Phobio. How did you know where Charybdis was sealed? Only us dryads knew the place, entrusted to us by the hero. She asked with unusual gravity in her voice. I do not believe you came upon it by coincidence. I was shown the place by two clowns wearing masks, Phobio replied immediately. Clowns wearing masks? Rimuru asked confused. Trainee however looked to contemplate something, then keeled down and drew something in the sand. It was a clown mask, with a winking face. Was one of it like this? She asked. Phobio sat up to look, then shook his head. No, none of them were like that. He began drawing next to the one trainee made. One was a little girl wearing a weeping mask, said her name was Tear. The other was a fat man wearing an angry mask, footman, he said. He explained as he drew. Out of the corner of his eye, Rimuru saw Benimaru tense. A fat man with an angry mask? The Orge asked with barely restrained anger. That was when Rimuru remembered. During his first encounter with the ogres, they said their village was attacked by orcs led by a masked Majin. He assumed at first it was Gelmid, but now. A fat man with a mask. Geld contemplated from the side. If I recall, there was a Majin like that calling himself Gelmud's agent, said he was from some kind of moderate alliance. The Moderate Harlequin Alliance, said Phobio. They said they took on all kind of odd jobs. Never heard of them before that though. Then even Gabiru seemed to want to say something. Well, I do recognize the mask lady trainee drew. He said as he stepped forward. He said he's an agent of Gelmid as well, called himself Laplace. Laplace, you say? Trainee said in an unusually hostile tone. Footman, huh? I'll remember that name, Benimaru said with a calm voice. He heard Milam say Gelmid was the guy in charge of the whole Orc Lord project, but I never heard of any Harlequin alliance or anything like that. She said absent-mindedly, I wish I could have met them. Her disappointment was however quickly replaced by a look of realization. Oh, but what if it's not Gelmid? What? Rimuru asked. Perhaps Clayman was plotting behind the scenes. Clayman, sounds familiar. Notice. Individual Clayman is one of the demon lords mentioned by Milam. Great Sage helpfully allowed him from asking aloud who that was. Instead he asked, why do you say that? He does love to scheme like this. If anyone were to try and sneak something like this under everyone's noses, it's definitely him. Milam suggested. However, as they did not have any real evidence, Rimuru decided to ignore it for the moment. Well, there's no helping it right now. We'll just have to keep an eye out for these mercenaries. For now, everyone get some rest, he shouted to his troops, who all roared in victory and began to disperse back to the city. He turned his attention to Phobio, and you, careful on your way home, yeah? He informed him as he himself turned to leave. Wait, Phobio called out to him as he hastily got up on his feet, you can't just forgive me just like that. He protested. It's fine. Rimuru reassured him dismissively, you're not innocent, but you were being used too. No one died, so we can just put it behind us. Right, Milam? He asked the demon lord. He figured she too would still have a beef with the beast man. Yup, it's okay. I wanted to give you a good wallop, but whatever, it's fine now. She proudly proclaimed. That okay with you, Carrion? What? Was all Rimuru could think before he heard the sounds of heavy footsteps. A large man with beastly features and blonde hair seemed to step in view out of nowhere, emitting a large aura. Hey, of course you knew I was here. Milam? He said in a gruff voice as he casually strolled towards them. Lord Carrion, Phobio screamed, shocked, as he hastily walked towards his master, so this is Demon Lord Carrion. Though Rimuru as he closely examined the man, his aura was quite something. Nothing close to Milam of course, but easily dwarfing his own or any of his subordinates. Suddenly, he hit Phobio so hard, he swore he could hear some bones breaking. The unfortunate beatsman now laid sprawled on the ground, bleeding, but Carrion continued nonchalantly. You cocky fool. Then, as if forgetting completely about what he did, he turned to face Rimuru. So, you there. A measly slime like you, starting your nation of monsters. He said as he got right up in Rimuru's face. You ate the Orc Lord, didn't you? He said, but it wasn't a question. So what if I did? Got a problem with that. He calmly shit back. Carrion was easily almost twice as tall though, so he had to really look up to say it to his face. After a short pause, Carrion billowed in laughter. FWA. Ha 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 ha. How funny. I can see why Milam likes you. Ha ha ha. After a few more seconds, he stopped and caught his breath, looking more serious. Anyway, I wanted to apologize for my follower acting out of control like he did. For what it's worth, he only had orders to investigate the Orc Lord, not cause all the problem he did. Of course, I still hold some fault. Hey, I really didn't think you'd send that knucklehead here. Milam interjected. I'd have though for sure you were more of the careful type. Ah, come on Milam. I think you have too big an opinion about me. This was a blunder on my part, he said, looking slightly embarrassed. Let's call it a holdover from my younger days. Ha 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 ha, oh, I get it now. Milim unhesitatingly laughed at his expense, though exactly at what Rimuru wasn't sure. Yeah, keep laughing. Carrion said, mildly annoyed, but he had a small smile on his lips. It is what it is. Anyways, Rimuru. Yes. Let's just say I owe you a favor for keeping my subordinate alive even after all he did. Rimuru wanted to ask what was the point, as Phobio was currently bleeding to death nearby on the ground, but wisely shut up and listened, so if there's anything I can do to make up, just say the word. Hearing the sincerity in Carrion's voice, Rimuru quickly got an idea. Anything? In that case, I would be interested in a treaty of non-aggression between our nations, he informed the Demon Lord. Is that all? Carrion asked, somewhat surprised. All right, deal. In the name of the Beastmaster Carrion, you have my word. Urizania will never bare its fangs towards Tempest, he said as he extended an arm forward. Rimuru extended his, and the two shook the agreement. He noticed Milim smiling on the side, but looking unusually solemn for some reason. He wondered how often Demon Lords made agreements like this. Before he could say anything more, he heard Carrion move. The large man picked up the unconscious, bleeding Phobio, and hefted him over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes. I'll send a proper envoy sometime later, okay? The Beastmaster said as he began walking away. Oh, and I'll make sure Phobio behaves next time. See y'all later, Rimuru, and disappeared in a flash. Thus ended yet another potential catastrophe from befalling on Tempest. The night after the battle against Charybdis was a hectic, if extremely merry. Shortly after the battle concluded, everyone from the soldiers to the evacuated civilians rushed back into the city to party. Even if he wanted to, Rimuru doubted he could have slowed them down. Which he didn't, and so the entire city of Tempest celebrated through the night. Everyone's stress and worries were suddenly gone and erupted in dancing, eating, drinking and various other activities. Someone had the crazy idea of taking the megalodon's literary flying sharks and cooking them. He wasn't so sure, but he didn't stop anyone from doing it. Thank goodness he didn't, because the giant sharks turned out to be quite delicious, especially with a good drink. The streets were packed with people having a good time, and Rimuru, though he continued to pay close attention so that no one was going too far, managed to finally enjoy himself some. He was sat at a specially set table in the central square of the city, filled with all kinds of foods and delicacies, though most of them weren't for him. He had decided to treat Milim to a well-deserved feast and ordered the cooks to make her some rare specialties. And it wasn't just because she had done a fantastic job against Charybdis. As they were returning to the city, he was greeted by the leader of the Dwarven Pegasus Knights who informed him they would not be staying to enjoy the festivities. Before leaving, however, the captain asked him about the weapon they had used to one-shot Charybdis. Rimuru pondered whether to tell him some made-up nonsense, but decided against it and told him the truth, that Demon Lord Milim, who was right next to him, had taken the beast out. He instantly regretted that decision. The man laughed at the idea of a little girl being the dreaded destroyer, completely ignorant of the murderous aura Milim sending his way. Then he just dismissed the issue, saying he can keep his secrets, then flew off. Calming Milim down from flying after them and slaughtering them to a man was, thankfully, easily done with the promise of food. So here he was, staying at the table next to Milim, who was scarfing down food at what would be an alarming rate for anyone else, but was actually pretty slow for her. He shook his head and smiled at her antics, then looked around to the festivities. Xian was somewhere in the corner, face red from way too much alcohol. She was swinging around wildly, possibly an attempt to dance, as Shuna was trying hard to calm her down as an amused Benimaru was looking on. Geld and Gabiru and some of their men had settled in a circle and were busy talking about the battle, laughing at each other's blunders. It was Gabiru's turn to be mocked by the looks of things, though he seemed to be laughing the most at it. Hakuro, Gobta and the human adventurers were also in their own little group, chatting away. Fuse especially was looking like he had too much and if he didn't knew better was picking a fight with a similarly drunk Kabul. Gobta seemed to be edging it on but was quickly calmed with just a glance from Hakuro. Looked like and he would be in for it tomorrow. In yet another corner, Kaijin, Vesta and the other dwarves were going over and gushing over one of Charybdis' scales they had recovered, Hundreds more were scattered through the forest. According to Kaijin, the thing's extremely durable and hard, yet also flexible, in terms of quality, not far below something made out of medium-grade magisteel. Nothing like what his high-grade magisteel could make, but still would be a useful resource once they were all gathered up, at least according to Kaijin. Rimuru had toned his explanation out halfway through and excused himself, and a good thing too because it didn't look like the five's conversation had slowed down at all in hours. Hey Rimuru, he turned to the sound of Milam's voice, who had stopped eating and was looking at him curiously. She was wearing a simple black blouse and white skirt. Did you say something? She asked. He didn't realize he ate aloud. Ah, no, nothing. He quickly dismissed. I was just really glad to see everyone having a great time, he said as he gazed over the merrymaking people. Yeah, this sure is a lively party, Milam exclaimed as she gulped down another drink. Though at first Rimuru wanted to slap it out of her hand, he quickly stopped himself. For one, this world did not have anything like a legal drinking age. Most nations simply let it up to their parents. Second, even if there was one, he realized Milam's somewhat childish personality aside is so much older it was almost hilarious. And thirdly, as Great Sage had informed him, Milam had poison resistance so high she could quite literally drink their entire city's supply of alcohol and not feel a single tingle from it. So he didn't bother stopping her, he figured she just enjoyed the new taste. But back to the present. Yeah, lively is one word. I know I said it before, but thanks for the help today. We really were screwed without you. Ah, think nothing of it, I mean it, she dismissed him again. I'm a demon lord. It's part of my job to do awesome things anyway. Wahahaha. Right, he said amused, shaking his head again, but I really do mean it. Personally, I mean, this city and its people mean a lot to me. You said that before. Yeah, I did. But I don't think I ever realized it myself just how much I cared until earlier today, when I almost thought we were out of options. He said honestly, so, for myself. He flashed a smile and put a hand on her shoulder. Thank you, Milam. Suddenly, Milam turned to look away from him. Though she looked to be embarrassed. He wasn't sure why though. Meanwhile, Milam was fuming with embarrassment. She almost thought her heart would leap out of her chest when she saw Rimmer smile at her like that. Ooh-ah! She screamed internally. This is getting seriously bad. Am I really doing this? Is it really? Ah, calm down. I can do this. I can do anything, yeah. Ah, but first, as she managed to calm her mental storm somewhat, then turned to Rimuru who didn't seem to have noticed just how far gone she was. Thank God for that. Rimuru, she asked as gingerly as she could, drawing his attention. Noticing she was in a weird mood, Rimuru turned his full attention on her. Yeah, what is it? She fidgeted a little before she could continue. I was just wondering, would it be okay for me to come back here when I can? He didn't know why, but he could feel a slight wave of panic rush him as he heard that. Why? Are you leaving? Is she leaving? Why so sudden? I mean, not right now. She frantically waved her hands, but a bit later, yeah. I have a few stuff I kinda have to do, you know? She said as she placed her hands on her knees. Need to check up on my followers, for one. Followers. He remembered hearing about how she didn't have any subordinates, but he guessed he heard wrong. Are they worried about you or? No, nothing like that. She dismissed. They aren't worried about me. I'm the strongest demon lord, so they are too terrified of me to be worried or anything. She turned to cast a strange look at the partying people, but I am their protector, so I kinda need to make an appearance once in a while. And other things. He wasn't sure what these other things were, but he didn't presume to guess. At another time, he would have dismissed them as meaningless nothings she entertained herself with. But he decided a while back to give her some benefit of the doubt, however. Milam. He drew her attention and made eye contact with her blue eyes. You'll always be welcomed here. Anytime you want. He told her with a smile. He was startled when she leapt forward, draping her hands around him and dragged him in a hug shouting, thanks. However, while he was happy she seemed to get whatever she had off her shoulders, he was royally panicking over something else. Ah, wah, no, stop hugging me. He mentally anguished, but not because he hated it, the opposite in fact, it made him happy. So happy he started getting scared. Please just, have some mercy on this poor slime. Before he could say anything, Milam let him go of him very, very quickly and dashed out of sight. He could barely discern anything, but he did though he saw a terror too. This time he didn't dismiss it. It was early morning after the massive citywide party, and the city was a mess. Dishes, empty tank, turntables, drink stains and sleeping drunk monsters and a pile of sleeping drunk humans littered the city streets. The few who had abstained from wasting themselves the night before were now starting to rouse people up and forcing them to start participating in the cleanup. In Rimaru's experience from his previous life, cleaning up after a party was the worst job ever, cleaning up after monsters was worse. But he still regretted nothing. What he did regret however was not running after Milam last night to see what was up with her. He followed her aura to her room with his magic sense, but decided against going there himself. For once, he didn't though it was a good idea to go into a girl's room just like that. Second, he really didn't know how to sort out the weird feelings he now had around her or even when just thinking of her, especially after last night's hug. The warmth of it still made him zone out at times, wishing she didn't stop. So he stayed, continuing to keep an eye on the party. When Shuna came by later to ask where Milam was, he didn't answer. For some reason the pink-haired ogress looked kind disappointed, a little mad even, before leaving with an exasperated sigh. At him. He wasn't sure why, but as the night progressed, he began to have a realization. As he watched the people begin to clean up, he thought about his past life. He never had a girlfriend or even a one-night stand, but more than he realized he never met anyone who really made him interested in starting a relationship. In fact, the best he could say was that he had a crush or three in high school, but that was it. A crush on the popular girl in class hardly counted as interested. At most it was teenage hormones going out of control, at worst a failure to even comprehend what liking someone was. His crushes were, in his opinion, superficial. He sure as hell liked to see some big assets, but that was wholly superficial, and he wasn't ashamed to admit it. But thinking on it, he never really felt genuine attraction for a woman in his life. He didn't knew Shizu for more than a day, and though there may have been something there, but that was long gone. Slipped away like water down a sink. Thinking on that, he realized that he liked her. He liked Milam. Immature, selfish, crazy powerful as she was, he still liked her. When he realized that, he didn't know what to think at first. Seriously. What's up with you, Rimuru? Are you some kind of lolicon? He wanted to admonish himself. Well, at least he could safely dismiss that though. He really liked big assets. So as far as he was concerned, this attraction was not exactly physical, though he admitted she was very pretty. So he started thinking about what he liked about her. Single quote. She's genuine. All the time. Was one of the first things he thought about. If she says she likes you, there isn't any hidden meaning, she just likes you. Immature as she is, she's pretty considerate, was another important thing he noticed. Being as powerful as she is, there's no real reason she should ever humor anyone with anything, like me asking her to tone down her power, but she does anyway. She loves life. He though with a fond smile at all the fun she had entertaining herself with the smallest things, there's no end to how much she wants to experience everything. He though of a few other things, but those three were what really made him look at her in a different manner than he had before. He though about all the things he didn't like, trying to find a way to deny it, but ultimately, could not. He did, in fact, like her. Ah crap, what do I do? He thought as he paced back and forth in his office. Do I tell her? Would she even really understand, or even care? Would she be cheaped out? He could not make any decision that day, but he did decided one thing. Even if he never told her, even if she hated him one day, he wanted to keep seeing her happy. He didn't know if she felt even remotely the same, but he didn't care. As long as he saw that smile that warmed his non-existing heart, he would be content. In all her many hundreds of years of life, nothing came close to being as confusing and terrifying as the feelings she was having now. Nothing Milam had experienced, and she had experienced far too many things that she cared to remember properly, helped her make sense of it all. In theory, she understood. She had understood it quite well when they were at that table and Rimuru had sent that charming smile her way. She hugged him, but quickly regretted it. It was even more impulsive than what she usually did, and she feared Rimuru hated her for it. Even if she heard Rimuru say she was always welcomed in Tempest, that fear of being hated by him made her almost lose her mind. She suspected, but that feeling she had when she hugged him convinced her. She was in love with Rimuru, and she had no idea what to do. What was she supposed to do next? She just couldn't come up with an answer that satisfied her. It hurt a lot just thinking about it, but the worst thing was that it made her so indecisive. She would usually make up her mind on something instantly, relying on her intuition to be right, which it usually was. This, however, failed her here. Her intuition just wasn't telling her anything, and she wasn't sure why. She knew what the feelings she had meant. She had heard it from many fellow demon lords, or listen in on conversations of her followers, among a few other sources, but how would she apply that to herself in her current situation? She was at a loss there. Not wanting to make a scene out of it, she ran from Rimuru as fast as she could, and was now held up in her guest room, hugging herself on the mattress, on the verge of crying. Why did I do something like that? She continually asked herself for hours. Rimuru said he was my friend, but if I say how I really feel, he'll. She almost couldn't even think of it, but, make me leave, or, say he actually hates me, were what she feared he would say. He seemed like he couldn't ever really hate anyone, but her fear just overwhelmed her anyway. There's no point. She thought dejectedly, Rimuru won't like back someone like me, would he? Yeah, I bet he sees me like some dumb kid. I even look like some dumb kid. Why would he bother, when he has girls like Shuna and Xian to consider? Not wanting to just make herself feel even worse by continuing to think about it like that, she considered just leaving right then and not looking back. Maybe, eventually, she'd just forget. She got up and began looking around to all the cloths she had received in her short stay. I should leave these, they'd only remind me, and turned to leave, planning to jump out the window and fly away. However, a knock on the door stopped her. She considered not answering, but decided against it. She went and opened and was met with Shuna. She was wearing a worried expression. Are you feeling okay, Lady Milam? She asked. Ah, what? The demon lord was caught off guard by that. Why was she worried about her? Nobody ever actually worried about her. On the other hand, Shuna was looking at her with even more concern. I saw you leave in a hurry, and I thought something bad might have happened with Sir Rimuru, she said as she walked into the room while Milam took a few steps back in. The smaller girl tried to avoid looking at her and come up with an excuse. Ah, ha, of course not. She tried to lie and hide all her emotions. Why would I? However, she was stopped when Shuna placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and asked with a smile. Please, you don't need to hide, the ogress said. Now, Milam was seriously at a loss. She had never actually had to try and explain something like this. She wasn't even sure if she wanted to, but Shuna's reassuring smile stopped her from running away and seemed to calm her turmoiling mind a little, enough that she made the decision that she could, just maybe, figure this out. And so she spent the next few hours explaining everything she felt about the leader of Tempest. She began ranting for a bit and went off topic, but Shuna didn't stop her and simply listened. The ogress had always liked the small Dragonoid, and was convinced that despite her power she was no different from any other person and, with the proper guidance, would become much better adjusted. She was pleased to see her becoming more considerate and mature as the weeks went by. So she listened. Eventually, Milam finished her rant, putting all her feelings for Rimuru out in the open. She felt her face was ready to melt away from how embarrassed she was and looked at everything but the other girl, who only started at her. After a while, she heard her sigh. You don't need to be scared, Lady Milam, she told her gently. I'm sure that if you talk to him, you'll feel better. Talking is always better than bottling it in, no matter what the feeling is. Milam considered carefully what she said. She mostly agreed that talking was better, but how would she even start? As if reading her mind, Shuna continued, how or when, I don't know. But if you don't, you'll just feel even worse, won't you? Milam could only nod and sigh, plopping herself backwards onto the bed. I'm sure someone like you would do it easily, she said slowly. Ha, you think? I'm not so sure, Shuna dismissed, looking a bit sad herself. Milam decided to ask something else. Would it really be okay, though? I mean, for me too, she stuttered. Ah, why not? No one in Tempest would object. Shuna reassured her. What about, you? At that, Shuna had a small, barely noticeable blush appear on her face. Ah, haha, no, it's not like that, I'm more of a. I really don't, she too stuttered for a while but quickly regained her composure. What I want the most is for Lord Rimuru to be happy. If he is, I could not possibly be mad. Why would I be here otherwise? I had some suspicions, after all, she told her with a light teasing smile. Milam began to panic. What? You did? But how? She shouted, but in a flash Shuna had gotten up and began moving towards the door. Hey, answer me. She screamed after her as Shuna stepped through the door, only stopping to offer one last supportive smile, then left. Milam felt like throwing something into the door after her, like the bed, but settled on a pillow. The middle of autumn was also the end of the harvest season, and Tempest was about to have its very first come to an end. It was, by all accounts, a major success, and so the citizens of Tempest, at Rimuru's suggestion, were preparing a festival that their leader hoped would become a yearly thing, a holiday they would all have to look forward to. One more thing to keep the sense of community they had built. With the preparations for that underway, Rimuru had become quite a bit more busy, though not only because of it. A few days after the Charybdis battle, Demon Lord Carrion, as promised, had sent an envoy. To his surprise, it was Phobio, but this time he was very courteous and friendly. In fact, he felt almost like a completely different person. He didn't know what his punishment was, but a quick conversation later he learned that Phobio had volunteered for the mission, so the fact that Carrion had allowed it meant he was satisfied. The Beastman had come with a letter from the Beastmaster, asking Tempest to send a delegation to Eurazania, while he would in turn send one to them. He decided on a date, then sent Phobio off with the assurance that he held no grudge at all. The Beastman had offered a genuine smile at that, then was gone. So now they had far more than just the festival to work for. They would need to prepare to host the envoys of a different nation, and this time it would not be some ad hoc meeting like when King Gazel invited himself over. This was official. Around the same time, King Gazel had sent an invitation, formally inviting Rimuru to come to Dwargo as the Chancellor of Tempest. He was, apparently, to be given the royal treatment which he supposed he was, which did absolutely nothing to calm his nerves. He once again thanked the heavens slimes didn't have hearts, because he was sure his would give in to the stress. But, he was committed, so he pushed on. Speaking of hearts, his metaphorical one was still in turmoil, ever since his epiphany on his feelings for their Dragonoid guests. He wondered just what, if anything, he should do and just came blank. For a week now, he tried burying himself in work and other activities to see if he could get his mind off of her, but could not. Especially since he still was, technically, the once in charge of handling her, so it wasn't like he could avoid her. A small mercy was that their interaction didn't seem to change much, if at all. She was still hyper-excitable about everything, and he was still trying to direct her from causing any damage. Of course, by now it was more of a running joke. He was very confident that she would not break anything important, and now that he had somewhat accepted how he felt, he found himself enjoying her presence and even looking forward if just a little to her antics. Even in his past life, he had always had a more childish side to himself, playing games with his nephews, reading manga, and generally goofing off when he had free time. This was basically more of the same to him. It felt nostalgic and he was thankful. However, he did feel something was a little off with Milam. What? He couldn't tell, but she was just slightly less selfish and childish, something which he was also thankful for. She had also completely ignored the whole hug incident, continuing as usual the next day as if nothing had happened. A few times, however, she looked like she really wanted to say something, but always changed her mind and tried to change the subject. Somewhere deep in his metaphorical heart, he dared to hope she wanted to say she liked him back. Ha ha, fat chance, Rimuru. He mocked himself over. And so the days carried on, and the harvest festival was now here. Rimuru stepped out from his office with Shion, wearing a simple outfit of white pants and a blue hoodie, having decided against some fancy formal wear. He also decided against some grand speech or ceremony. He just told everyone to have a good time and be merry, because that was what this festival was about. As he and Shion entered the main hall, he was suddenly assaulted. Rimuru. Milam's voice rang out as she rushed into the hall, followed closely by Shuna. How do I look? She eagerly asked. Rimuru once again thanked his lucky stars for slime biology. Milam's outfit was nothing fancy, just a simple red yukata, and her hair was loose. But it was probably the best she had ever looked since arriving in Tempest, at least he certainly thought so. Speaking of Rimuru's thoughts. Ah, no, that is way too freaking cute. No, why are you doing this to me? Trying really hard to not freak out, he ordered Great Sage to control his face and keep it from exploding red, and cast a quick glance at Shuna, who was wearing a small wry smile. Shuna. He wanted to shout at the ogress, he didn't have any proof, but he was sure she at least suspected something, since he caught her giving him several weird glances whenever he was with Milam. You look really great, Milam, he complimented her while suppressing his other opinions. Milam had a small blush appear on her face as she looked away. Thank you, but as usual, she was quick to perk back up, grabbing his hand and dragging him out through the door. Let's go. Deciding that it would do no one any good to dwell on the situation, he decided to let her. Outside, the citizens of Tempest were bustling in the streets, lamps overhanded from most buildings and various treats and drinks were served in stalls. Sweet aromas lingered in the air. Before anything else, he was accosted by his counselors and forced to give a speech after all. Everyone was gathered together in the main square and was looking at him on the platform they had set up for such occasions. He decided to have some fun with it, and told everyone to get a glass of something to drink. He himself had poured himself a glass of the new brandy he had created. Once everyone was there, he signaled them to be quiet. They instantly obeyed. I won't bore you with something long and boring, he told them honestly. This day, this festival, is not for that kind of thing. This day is for us to come together and have fun. Nothing else. It's the time of the year when we stop to celebrate our long year of work and toil and enjoy the fruits of our labor. So for another productive and happy year, he raised his glass high. Cheers. For Tempest. And downed the glass. Everyone in the crowd cheered and repeated his words and drank. And so the festival began in full swing. Just like he had hoped, fun and joy filled the streets. It was the start of a tradition that would carry on through the entire history of Tempest, he realized, but for now Rimuru was busy enjoying every moment of the festivities. He would leave future problems for future him. As night dragged on, the festivities didn't show any sign of slowing down. In fact, the night just seemed to make everything go into overdrive. He had never said just how long the festival should last, so he just decided to let the people's stamina run its course. He was talking about monsters, of course, so that made things difficult to judge how long it would take, but he let it be for now. Eventually, however, he decided he really should step back a bit and make sure no one was going too far. As much as he didn't want to, he left Milam with Shuna and began making the rounds. He stopped at nearly every corner, talking with his people and listening away at the various conversations. It dawned on him that he didn't even let a few good hours pass before he got back to work, but oh well. He enjoyed this just as much. Mostly. After a while, he decided it was time to check up on a special project he had Vesta and Gabiru work on. He found the pair a bit outside of the city with a group of Dragonoid carrying some boxes. He smiled at the though of his scheme as he approached them. Everything's set? He asked Vesta, who shot him back a smile. Oh, yes sir. He sounded more excited than him. I have the supreme confidence you'll be very pleased. Ha ha, indeed. Gabiru exclaimed, it will be the greatest show you have ever witnessed. Leave it to us. I'm counting on you, he told them and walked back into the city, grinning. He couldn't wait to see the look on everyone's faces. He made his way to the top of the main government building, sat down over the edge and waited. He looked up at the starry night, and really came to appreciate their beauty for real as he smiled. I told you they were pretty. He was startled by a voice. Turning to look behind him, he saw Milam floating down with a smug look of, I told you so. He smiled back. Yes, you did, he admitted, thinking back at the time she first arrived. He also tried really hard to suppress any blush that would appear as he thought of how the discussion she mentioned happened while she was completely naked with him in the hot bath. Don't think about it, don't think about it, don't think. I thought about it, dang it. He tried and failed to not go back to that image. Hey, you okay? Milam asked as she plopped herself down next to him. You look a bit off, she asked with eyes full of worry. Well, I sure as hell can't tell her why I'm off. Rimuru though to himself, and tried to make up a story that wasn't a lie. It's just, I have a lot to work on, busy. Barley had time to enjoy the festival. It wasn't a lie, technically, just deflection, so he hoped it did the trick. He looked over at her and she seemed to want to say something. This time, however, something was different. She smiled and nodded. Okay, she said gently as they locked eyes, can I tell you something, though? Of course. What is she up to? He wondered as she took a deep breath, looking as if she was trying to calm herself from something and contemplating how to start. She began, I didn't know if I should even tell you anything, so, will you promise you won't laugh or anything? She asked with what looked like a hint of fear in her voice. He didn't know why she would think that, but he nodded. I also didn't know how to say it. I'm usually not this hesitant, My instincts are like always right, so I make quick decisions about anything I do, but now, she began fidgeting with her hands, I got scared. Scared of what? He asked in worry. That's you'd hate me, she answered, sounding like she wanted to cry, but even if you do, I have to tell you. Hate you? Why? He didn't get to say anything more though as she turned to face him fully and looked him straight in the eyes, ready to accept any answer he had. I love you. I love you. Rimuru's head went blank. For what felt like hours, he just could not wrap his mind around what he had just heard. Was he delusional? He couldn't tell anymore. He tried to focus on the girl in front of him, trying to see if maybe he misheard and she said something else. Her entire face was red and it looked like steam was coming off of her head. No, I couldn't have heard right, that is, she what? His mind viciously fought to make sense of it. He was sure he looked like an idiot, but he couldn't be bothered to care. After a few more seconds, he finally realized he really did hear it, that she said she loved him. You, what? Was all the sounds he could make. Milam looked even more embarrassed than before, somehow, and nervously began to fidget with her yukata, her eyes trying to focus on anything but Rimuru's and mumbling incoherent sounds. Milam, he tried to say but found he just didn't have the words. Not once did he ever though of what he would say to her if this situation came up. It just wasn't even an option. He tried desperately to rack his brain for an appropriate answer. But then he realized, looking at the panicking Milam, that whatever he felt was probably nothing. She looked ready to faint at any moment. Right, I'm being foolish, aren't I? He thought to himself and made a decision. Damn it, I always say that I'm the mature one around here, I need to start acting like it. Stealing his resolve, he grabbed the girl's hands before she ripped a hole in her dress with her fidgeting, startling her. Then she froze, unable to look away as he locked eyes with her. Gulping, he answered, Milam, I like you too. Though he sounded corny as hell, but whatever did the job, he would take it. Was all Milam could muster in surprise. I said I like. He said to alleviate her confusion, no. I love you too. He began scratching the back of his head, trying to find the right words and breaking eye contact. Damn it, I'm awful at this, sorry, but, before he could finish, he was interrupted by a sob. He looked over at Milam, who had a tear run down her face. He never felt more panic in his entire existence and over 2 lives, it was enough to nearly bring him to tears too, but fortunately Milam spoke up. No, I'm just, really happy, she said in between sobs. Not able to find more words to say, she decided to simply say nothing and threw her arms around Rimuru's neck, pulling him into a hug. As she buried her face into his shoulder, he gingerly wrapped his own arms around her, accepting the gesture. It's okay, he tried to reassure her, but she continued to sob for a few more minutes before calming down. They stayed like that for a while, neither wanting to break the silence, but eventually Rimuru decided to take charge. Are you okay now? He asked as he gently pulled her back so he could look her in the eyes, more calmly but still with some tears in her eyes. Milam nodded, then began wiping her eyes with one arm. He smiled and took her hand away before wiping her with his hand. Better. She nodded again. He pulled her back in a hug. He wanted to stay like that for as long as possible, but life had other plans. All across the forests, a number of bright trails began rising upwards, drawing the attention of everyone in the city, including Rimuru and Milam. A few seconds later, the sky was filled with a dazzling array of light of various colors and patterns. Pretty much everyone in the city stopped doing whatever they were doing and stared at the display, awed. Staring up at Vesta's and Gabiru's handiwork, Rimuru smiled broadly and threw a hand around Milam. He had completely forgotten about the fireworks he had made the two to create for him, with instructions from Great Sage. He had planned to go see everyone's reaction, especially Milam's, and now he had a front row seat. She had that look on her face whenever she experienced something new, staring starry eyes at the sky with a huge smile on her face. It was exactly the kind of thing he had come to really like seeing at her, and right now, he was certain he made the right decision to allow her to stay when he did. "Hey Milam," he called. She looked over at him, before realizing their position, then blushed before looking away again. "I'm glad we're closer," he dreaded saying, "together," as he still wasn't sure if they would be considered that yet, but yeah. She looked back at him with a hint of panic in her voice, maybe because she heard the word, but. "I'd like it if we took it, slow," he reassured her. "I want to do this right, if I can," he explained. She had that look when she contemplated things, then began scratching at her cheek. "Ah, haha, okay," she laughed nervously. "I'm fine with that. It's not like I have any idea what I'm doing from here," she admitted sheepishly. "It's just. I never felt like this, about anyone, so," she tried to explain herself. Rimuru understood where she was coming from. Even with all his years, with no actual experience on the issue, he felt like the prospect of a relationship now was like climbing a huge mountain as an amateur. She was literally centuries older, and had admitted to never have experienced anything of the sort before. He could not really fathom what it must have felt like to her. But, me either, he wasn't gonna let some tiny mountain get in the way, so let's see together, yeah. He smiled. She smiled back. Dawn broke upon Tempest, startling the city of monsters awake. Or at least those who were not yet awake, as many had been woken up hours earlier, either by or as those responsible with the cleanup. The city was again bustling with activity and would soon begin another day. More than anything, many wanted their lord to wake up to a clean and orderly city and be proud of them. Of course, Rimuru, as a slime, could not really sleep. He didn't need to, but he had learned to, essentially, force it. Whenever he went overboard with naming monsters, he would fall into a deep, slumber-like state as he recuperated, though he was still conscious. With the help of Great Sage, he began experimenting and reached a state where he was, for all intents and purpose, unconscious and could even dream. At least though he was dreaming, he wasn't sure, as the memories were hazy like a real dream, he supposed. The important part was that he could shut down and rest, as being awake all the time began to take some toll on his psyche at first. He was originally a human who had to sleep, after all, and it was just ingrained in his soul, he concluded. And so, he occasionally allowed himself to sleep, such as on this. Unlike normal sleeping, he did not slowly and grudgingly wake up. It was more like a switch was flipped and he was back online. It was better than nothing. And this time, he had quite the great view awaiting him. He was sat on the sofa located in his office, head resting on one of its soft handle, and resting on his chest was Milam, snoring softly, hair loose and sprawled all over and covered by his blue overcoat. He took a second to stare at her peaceful, content sleeping face and smiled. After the events of last night, they had spent a few hours just talking over. When he heard she had been so terrified of being rejected she nearly ran away, his heart broke. He wasn't sure how things would work out, but he was sure of one thing: he would do anything he could to keep that smile he loved so much. After a few hours, they decided to head inside, mostly because Rimuru didn't want anyone to see them. He wasn't sure how he would break the news to people. Once they settled on the sofa, however, Milam had fallen asleep really quickly, resting on his shoulder. Not wanting to disturb her, he let it be and at some point decided to rest himself. He watched her for a few minutes and absent-mindedly began stroking her hair. He heard her stir up and slowly open her eyes to look up at him. He froze and stopped what he was doing. "Hey," he said awkwardly. After a few more seconds, realizing the position they were in, Milam's eyes shot wide open and she quickly shut up. She tried to form a sentence but failed. He smiled and took her hand. "Morning," he said in as casual as manner as he could, trying to calm her down a bit. It mostly worked. Morning, she replied. You hungry? He said as he got up, still holding her hand. She didn't reply. So, anything you want to do? He asked. She looked up. I don't know. What do people usually do next? She asked. He tried to rack his brain on that. I don't really know. He said more to himself. I mean, would you like to go out of a date? Date? She asked with a curious look. Yeah, a date, it's when you go out with someone you like and have fun and stuff. Weren't we doing that before? She asked. No, not quite, he tried to explain. Going on a date is, well, he never went on a date before so he didn't really know the damn difference anyway. So he tried to make something up that sounded good, it's official, and stuff, and naturally failed, not that Milam seemed to realize. Ooh, she said with excitement, official, sounded really good to her, then yeah, let's go. She said as she quickly got up too and asked, where are we going? He really didn't know, but didn't want to disappoint her. We can just walk around the city, like usual. Really, he wasn't sure just how corny that sounded, but again, Milam didn't seem to care because she looked really exited. Perhaps I can help, a voice suddenly interrupted, startling them both. Standing in the door, looking equally parts pleased and annoyed, was Shuna. Shuna, he screamed, how long have you been there? He asked in a panic. Besides him, Milam was blushing madly. Around the time you asked if she was hungry, she casually said. Oh no. Rimuru, though embarrassed, Shuna ignored his concerns and continued talking as she entered the room. Perhaps I could make a special dinner tonight for this, Lord Rimuru. She said. Special dinner. He heard Milam say. He smiled at how her love for food made her so easily won over. On the other hand, Shuna's idea sounded pretty okay to him. You would. I appreciate it, he wanted to say more but Shuna stopped him. But, I only ask that you come clean with your relationship to everyone. At this, Rimuru wasn't sure what to say. Sensing his hesitation, Shuna continued, you can make an announcement at today's council meeting. No one will be upset. He thought it over. It was true that everyone was very supportive of him, and no one seemed to dislike Milam either, so. Yeah, it sounds like a good idea. I should do it. Could you call everyone in? Shuna bowed slightly and without another word left to call a meeting. He sighed and looked over at Milam, who must have sensed his trepidation because she squeezed his hand a little. A while later, the room was filled with his top counselors. Not wanting to waste everyone's time, he decided to get to the main point as fast as possible, and began giving them the short version. So, in short, he concluded while scratching the back of his head, trying to not look at anyone in particular. Me and Milam are a thing now. After a few more seconds, he got up the courage to look at them and gauge their reaction. As expected, some were shocked, mouth agape, but most just looked to calmly consider the news. The most vocal, of course, was Shion. I knew something was up. She screamed. He doubted she knew anything, but kept that though to himself. Lady Milam, it's not fair. Snatching Lord Rimuru all for yourself. Despite the absurd things she said, it didn't sound to him like she was being malicious. In fact, she sounded more mad. Milam didn't tell her first. He knew the ogress had grown fond of Milam but didn't though it was that much. Why would I, one horn? It's no big deal. Milam tried to sound dismissive, but the huge blush on her face very much evaporated any credibility she had. Shion, don't be mean. Shuna told his secretary, we should be happy for Lord Rimuru. I am. The ogress shouted back, it's just a bit sudden. She finished with more seriously, not realizing she outed herself that no, she didn't know anything. Benimaru spoke up, well, as long as you know what you're doing, sir. He said with a small smirk. We have no objections, but, he looked to contemplate how to say what was on his mind. Would it be a problem? If the other demon lords know about it, I mean. This question was obviously more directed towards Milam. Indeed. Hakuro said, and many others nodded their heads. Rimuru turned to Milam to see what she had to say. She was still blushing but had a more serious look on her face, thinking hard about something. No, I don't think it'll be any problem. She said, most of them won't really care at all, and if they do, she smirked, this is me we're talking about. They can suck it, she proclaimed with arms crossed. He wasn't sure that was the best attitude, but he supposed she was the strongest of the demon lords. They would have to be pretty foolish to pick a fight with her. Besides, she added with a bit more gravitas, it's not like I'm conquering the forest or something. He supposed that was also fair. From what he heard, the demon lords practiced a very delicate balance of power, trying to keep things as stable as possible between them as well as with the rest of the world. If one of them did in fact try to take over the entire Jura forest, with its vast resources and population of monsters, it would certainly break the balance. However, as far as he could tell, Milim had absolutely zero interest in that kind of thing, and if he knew it so did the other demon lords, so he wondered if even one of them would consider her being here as anything other than her usual bout of fancy. Milim certainly didn't seem to think they would. But even so. For now, I would like this to not leave Tempest, if that's okay with you. He asked Milim. She shrugged, I don't really care if they know or not, she dismissed. Very well, sir, Soe immediately said, already knowing what Rimuru wanted to tell him. Me and my team will make sure this information does not leave Tempest without your permission, and he vanished. Seriously, this guy, he scares me sometimes. Rimuru though. Well, sir, we do sincerely wish you and Lady Milim to be happy. Rigurd exclaimed, looking like he was on the verge of tears. I wish you the best. No, now he was crying. His son, Rigurd smiled apologetically and began leading the old hobgoblin away. Some of the others too began dispersing. Ah, well, I'll see ya tonight, okay. Milim suddenly said, still red, go make myself useful somewhere, and quickly vanished before he could say anything. He scratched his head, wondering what that was. It looks like she'll take some time getting used to this, Lord Rimuru, Shuna said amused. Ah, so that's what it is. He couldn't really blame her. He kinda wanted to hide too, that meeting was embarrassing. Well, I'll get to work too. Shuna, he looked over at the ogress with a smile, thank you, I mean it. It is no problem at it, sir. She answered back with her own smile, and as promised, tonight I will come up with something very special for your diner date. She finished with a wink, the left too. Unknown to him, she was beaming inside. The whole thing had given her a great idea about a new outfit for Milim, one she was sure would make Rimuru fall over himself. Her evil plan in mind, she left for her workshop. As he watched the ogress leave, Rimuru suddenly had a chill run through his body. What was that? He also suddenly had the urge to follow Milim's lead and run, but it was too late. Lord Rimuru, congratulations, my lord, such good news. As expected of Lord Rimuru, wooing even the greatest demon lords. Lord Rimuru, when do we start planning the wedding? Were but a few of the many such compliments he had to receive over the course of the following day. He wasn't sure who let it out first, but the news of him and Milim spread like wildfire. Even thought communication didn't account how fast it spread, as far as Rimuru was concerned. He almost felt like the entire city was eavesdropping on their conversation. He felt really sorry for Soe. Keeping this locked up would be an undertaking even for him, but at the same time he was confident he would do it. Other than the barrage of congratulations and questions, very uncomfortable questions, the day went on with no problems. There were no major issues, incoming calamities, diplomatic incidents or other such shenanigans. All their work was progressing steadily forward. The streets were crisp, so much so no one could tell there had been a large festival just the night before. A few small things came up, such as some minor decisions on their incoming exchange of delegates with Eurazania. Speaking of Eurazania, he wondered if he should come clean to Carrion once proper relations were established with his kingdom. From what he saw when he had visited to collect Phobio, the Beastmaster and Milim got along really well. At the very least, they had a healthy mutual respect. He didn't think it would be any problems. He would cross that bridge when he got there. Right now, he had a date to get ready for. After some coaxing begging from Xian, he agreed to let her pick what he would wear. Surprisingly, she had something sensible in mind. A simple suite that Shuna had designed for his upcoming visit to Dwargo but abandoned. Incidentally, though it would be perfectly suited to wear when he would see his own delegates off to Eurozania, but right now it would serve a more selfish purpose. Dressed up, he had to convince Xian that no, she could not come along to the date. Though she begged and pleaded, he didn't budge. Though she didn't cry, she eventually agreed to leave. Sulking, he felt kinda bad about it, so he decided he would make it up to her in the future. Next was convincing Ranga to leave his shadow. He liked the Tempest Wolf, but he could be far too clingy, and he also didn't want spectators. Eventually he had to be a bit more forceful. Go and do something else, you big baby. He snapped. The wolf finally left, tail between his legs. Again, he felt really sorry about that, and would make it up to him later. Finally, as night loomed, the time was almost there. He decided his office would suffice for the diner, no need to complicate things, and they didn't yet have any fancy restaurant or anything, so it would do. However, he did have some furniture better suited for diner hauled in, with a few other preparations. He even got candles ready. He was always a sucker for clichés. He then waited for Milam to arrive. Shuna had told him earlier she would take care of the Dragonoid, as she had something special planned. Another chill ran through Rimaru's body when he heard that. Not long afterwards, he could hear a pair of footsteps rapidly approaching, and the door swung open a moment later, though not too roughly to break it. He was sure Rigard would be sleeping well. Anyways, Milam jolted into the room with a bright, beaming smile, the kind he always had whenever she got something new to wear. Hey, Rimuru. How do I look? She excitedly asked while doing a twirl. Single quote. Oh no, not again. He though and thanked the stars that he had learned the ability to control his outward reactions better. Milam was wearing a loose, one-piece pink dress that went all the way down to her knees, with long sleeves and a red ribbon on her chest. Her hair was in her usual twin tails. It was simple, but on her it looked really well. By now, he was convinced she could make anything work well. I can't take much more of this, he complained, though not really, and turned his attention to the real culprit, who was coming in from behind Milam, Shuna. Well, what do you think, Lord Rimuru? The ogress asked teasingly with a smile. You, evil woman. He wanted to scream at her. You know exactly what I think already, don't you? Suddenly, as if she heard what he though, her eyes stopped smiling, though her face still was. I'm sorry. He mentally prostrated himself, then began raking his brain to find an appropriate answer. You look amazing, Milam, he said eventually. The girl stopped her posing and stared before blushing, though not as much as before. Beautiful, even, he finished as he got closer, ignoring Shuna who was still smirking. Hee, that's the first time I got that kind of compliment. Milam said bashfully. It makes me kinda happy. He smiled and took her hand. He didn't know how long they remained standing there, looking in each other's eyes, but at some point Shuna had left, no doubt to prepare their diner. Noticing that, he decided to lead Milam to the table. She reached for one of the chairs, but Rimuru got there first and pulled it for her. Ah, no, she tried to protest. You don't have to do, but Rimuru immediately interrupted. Nonsense. He dismissed, it's only the gentleman thing to do. He told her with a charming smile. She blushed again and decided to humor him. After she was seated, he sat down himself across from her. The atmosphere was kinda awkward, and he wasn't sure how to break the silence. Luckily for him, Milam had something to say. Hey, Rimuru. She said slowly, looked hesitant. I'm sorry, I just kinda, ran off this morning. Rimuru though, why is that a problem? He wondered to himself. I was just really embarrassed, she said sheepishly. Rimuru stared for a bit, then had to laugh. Hey, what gives? She immediately asked. After managing to stop, he explained himself. Oh, nothing. But that was what I kinda wanted to do too. He told her, then continued chuckling to himself. After a few seconds, she joined in. With the awkward atmosphere gone, they began to chat about various stuff, mostly how their day went. Turned out, Milam did indeed made herself useful, although it was more of a whim than anything. She flew into the forests and saw Geld and his orcs hauling the materials for their road construction, and offered a hand. And by offered a hand, she hauled their building materials for the next month within an hour. She must have cut down their timetable by at least half. The rest of the day was pretty uneventful. Ah,
But, I could have done without every single person I ran into going on about how happy they were for, us, she said at the end.
You too, huh? Rimuru chuckled. Yeah, I know. He wanted to ask if any of those knuckleheads said anything too. Embarrassing. But decided against it. It was bad enough they asked him. He didn't want her to have any ideas. Ignorance was bliss, after all.
You have really nice people, Rimuru, she said suddenly. He noticed she sounded a bit sad, but he couldn't place it why. He though about what she said, though. Single quote. Yeah, I do, don't I? He said. Everyone here is interesting and friendly.
I think I get why it's so important to you, now, she said smiling. He recalled the short conversation they had a while back. But, you know. This time she had a serious look on her face. Some people might notice you. And want to take it from you. He wasn't sure what she meant by that. He wanted to ask when Shuna walked into the room with a few servants carting trays of food. Any hope of asking Milam was gone now. She was in full food mode. He smiled and shook his head at her. The food was, as Shuna had promised, something else. If he had to rate it, he would easily put it there with the top dishes in a 5-star restaurant. He wasn't sure where she even got some of the ingredients, but otherwise he was very much impressed. And Milam, of course, loved every bite. After finishing the main dishes, the ogress brought in a special dessert that he had helped design. It was just ice cream, really, but just making it in this world was a major success, especially with Milam. After dessert, they continued talking for a few hours. He learned some new things about, such as few bits and pieces about her followers the Dragon Faithful in the City of the Forgotten Dragon and a few accounts about some random adventures she had over the years. She had been around for centuries, so he imagined she had quite a few more stories to tell, if she even bothered to remember half of them, that is. Around midnight, Milam suddenly got the idea to drag him to the onsen. She was full, and now wanted to enjoy a hot dip. Internally, Rimuru was in turmoil. On one hand, it wasn't like he hadn't seen everything already, but on the other that was under the understanding that they were just friends. This was something else. He wanted to scream and protest, but she would have none of it. She magically teleported her dress off and dragged him in the pool with her ridiculous strength. Fortunately, he managed to change into his slime form and safely store away his suit before it got wet. Doubly fortunate, Milam didn't seem to care it was his slime form and didn't ask him to change into his human one. He wasn't sure he could even look her in the eyes if he stayed like that. As usual, she spent the first few minutes splashing and swimming around. He knew better than to try and talk her out of it and just let it. It wasn't like he liked seeing her have fun like that. Not at all. After a while, she settled down and allowed herself to soak up in the warm water. Ah, finally, I can relax too. But his calm was short-lived as she quickly swam over to him and picked him up in a hug. No, he screamed internally at the position he found himself in. Milam was curled up, holding him on her legs and rested her head on top of him. A blissful smile on her face. Naturally, certain parts were pressed against him. Wait, he wanted to shout, this is too quick. He wasn't sure she understood just how bad this position was for him, or good, he would say in the deepest parts of his soul, or if she just didn't care. She certainly never really showed much resignation in showing skin before. In any case, he always considered himself a gentleman and didn't want to take advantage of her ignorance or uninterest, whichever it was. He heaved up the courage to speak up, but noticed she had fallen asleep. Well, he thought to himself awkwardly, guess I have no choice but stay like this for a bit. How awful. Eventually, however, he decided that he really needed to get both of them out of there before someone came along and saw them. He asked Great Sage to do something about Milam's clothes for him. He really didn't want to step out of bounds. Fortunately, his super handy ability was quickly able to equip some cloths on her while at the same time get the both out of the water. Once out, he gingerly picked her up and headed for her room, careful to avoid anyone. Once he arrived, he gently placed her on her bed, covered her and turned to leave, however a small hand grabbed his shirt. He looked down and saw Milam, still more asleep than awake, look up at him with pleading eyes. Could you stay? She said softly. Ah, damn. No way I could possibly say no, he told himself as he looked at her bright, pleading blue eyes. He decided to throw his worries to the wind. He got into the bed too, allowing her to cuddle up right next to him. She was fast asleep again before he could even pull the blanket back up.
He smiled softly and leaned down to kiss the top of her head, then allowed himself to drift to sleep too.
Alright troops, pay attention, General Rimuru bellowed to his assembled soldiers, our enemy is down to their last forces. We have the advantage, and so we will press for one final assault, prepare yourselves. Everyone cheered. That is, all the children in his group that were partaking in Operation Snowball Fight. The first snow had arrived in Tempest, something which he was told would not last very long. The region was generally warm and winter was fairly short. For the most part, monsters and humans around did not see much cold weather, and many winter seasons passed with no snow. Indeed, the former years seemed to have passed so quickly because his first winter in the new world was an unusually warm one. He didn't even knew it was winter at the time until after it was nearly over. He was thus feeling pretty lucky that this one had record snowfall. Of course, for a city such as his, snow could be something of an impediment, but he had always liked it. Currently, he and a number of children in the city were playing in the nearby forest, blanketed by a deep cover of snow, and competing against several other groups led by the various adults who wanted to join in. It had been a fierce fight, with many casualties, but his group managed to pull through and now the enemy teams were down to one. Unfortunately, that team was the one led by Milam herself, and so when he told them they had the advantage, he was being a tad bit overdramatic. He was met with blank stares. He coughed, then decided for a different approach. Okay, maybe we're actually in deep trouble, but I know we can win if we play our cards right. Here's the plan, and so began explaining to the troops his brilliant tactics, and while it did manage to raise morale for a bit, it quickly went downhill for them. While his plan was fairly sound, it did failed in one very important aspect. Namely, it relied on the enemy, especially Milam, playing fair. And, as it turned out, she was not about to do that. As they were leaving the large trench they dug out for cover, they were quickly beset by a hail of snowballs. In an ambush, one of the children shouted, trying to run for cover but was quickly and mercilessly cut down. What? Rimuru shouted, barely dodging a few stray balls, retreat. As he directed his troops back to safety, he tried to track the direction from which the enemy was attacking. They were well hidden among the trees, but he managed to locate them. New plan in mind, he ducked back into the trench, ready to direct the counterattack, but was met with a grueling sight. All his troops were down, sprayed across the ground with snowballs in their backs. No one was spared. Panicked, he tried to slowly back away and run for it, but it was too late. Going somewhere? A voice said from behind him. With a sigh, he slowly raised his hands in surrender and turned around to face the enemy. Milam smiled smugly, snowball in hand, as she stood over the bodies of her enemies. I didn't think you'd be up for this kind of infiltration attack. Rimuru told her with a scowl. I was sure you were more of the full frontal attack kind of girl. Wahahaha. Don't look down on me, Rimuru, she said as her smile grew wider. Anything goes in a fight. Mercy has no place on the battlefield. Now, she prepared to launch her weapon. I'm feeling generous, so I'll let you decide how to end this. Take it like a man, run away, try and fight, it's all the same to me. Rimuru looked at her and her weapon, then at all his fallen comrades. Grimacing, he made his decision. I think I'll take my chances and fight. She launched the ball straight at him with incredible speed, but he managed to barely avoid it by changing into his slime form, launching himself into the air with a water jet. Hey, no fair, she shouted as he flew away. What was that? He asked mockingly, didn't you say anything goes in a fight? Well, I'm a fast learner, and so he turned his attention away from the pouting Dragonoid and diverted it at her troops, which had arrogantly left their cover and were approaching his trench, thinking they had won. Well, it may be true he had little hope of defeating Milam, truth be told, but he was going to make it a Pyrrhic victory if there ever was one. Water control, he shouted as he prepared a massive attack aimed at the enemy. Snowball rain. He launched his assault, a hail of snowballs he had made inside his body with water control. Shooting them like a freaking machine gun, the effect was much like real trench warfare. The enemy was cut down in seconds under the relentless hail of projectiles. It was over in seconds. None were shown any mercy. Hastily turning back into his human form, he landed some distance away, looking at his handiwork. He smiled. ready to meet his own end at the hands of the enemy commander. He thought he was ready for anything, but once again he had underestimated Milam. He sensed her jumping out of the trench and turned to look at her. He quickly took a step back in fear when he saw she had an angry-ish scowl on her face and was floating high above him, holding a massive snowball in her hands, aiming straight at him. Realizing he had little hope to avoid it, he sighed, smiled and closed his eyes, deciding to meet the end like a man. The forest echoed with a loud thud as the attack engulfed the leader of Tempest. Sometime later, everyone was gathered together around a bonfire, laughing and arguing. Despite the cold, everyone was merry. Of course, Rimuru and Milam had such a high degree of resistance to most things. A little winter cold did not affect them at all. Even so, like everyone else, they wore thick coats and boots to blend in better. Milam's was pink, while Rimuru's was blue. Ha ha ha, we totally won, one of the kids from Milam's group boasted while laughing at the enemy, who booed him. No you didn't, a girl from Rimuru's group shot back, you got taken out even before the rest. Wah. Why you? The kid scowled, our leader survived to the end, so it's our win. A cheer of, yeah, and, that's right, rang out from among his comrades as they continued to bicker. Rimuru shook his head but continued to smile, glad everyone was so lively. He was especially happy to see how Milam was having so much fun. She was smiling ear to ear and cheering along with the rest of her team while occasionally teasing him and his group. The two were holding hands, sitting alongside each other on the same log. The lively discussion continued for a few more minutes until Shunek came along with a few goblinas, each bringing trays of warm tea for everyone to enjoy. After drinking up, the group enjoyed the setting sun, and soon it was time for most of the children to return home. The ones from Milam's group especially wanted to stay a bit longer and enjoy their victory with their fearless leader. But Shunek quickly made them scuttle home with a single glare. As she made to leave too, Shuna turned to look at the two and asked, "Aren't you going home?" shaking her head when she realized they were almost too preoccupied with each other to hear what she said. Sporting a teasing smile, she repeated her question. The two looked away, embarrassed, while Rimuru spoke up, no, we'll stay for just a bit longer." The ogress smiled warmly and left, leaving them alone. Rimuru gulped, wondering how much longer they were gonna be the subject of teasing for the ogre princess. He didn't much care to find out. They stayed silent for a bit longer, looking up into the clear, winter sky as the stars started to become visible. He felt Milam lean her head against his shoulder, smile and place a hand over her to draw her closer. Just because the cold didn't affect her didn't mean he couldn't pretend to be like a normal couple. Even though, realistically speaking, there was nothing normal about either of them. He thought back to the last few days they had spent together. Hey, he absent-mindedly laughed, drawing her attention. What? She asked. Nothing much, he answered back, smiling, I was just thinking how great you got along with all the kids. She looked slightly embarrassed at his words, looking away to hide her blush. He laughed softly at her reaction. Even though they had been together for a bit, she still had that reaction whenever he praised her for something. He tightened his hold on her shoulder a bit more and leaned back a bit, looking up into the sky. Hey, Rimuru? She asked softly. I was just wondering. Why did you build this city for? She asked as they made eye contact. He stared for a bit, wondering what brought that question, and pondered just how to answer. Well, at first, just because they asked me to help. I could never say no to someone asking for help, he said as he scratched his cheek, they just looked so down, especially Rigard, so I helped them. After that, it wasn't like I could abandon them. He sighed and smiled as he remembered all the things he and his people had went through in the nearly 2 years since he had been here. Wow, it's really been that long, he thought to himself in realization. He continued talking to Milam, who was listening intently. I'd be lying if I said I didn't do it for myself too, though. I just wanted to live a leisurely, easy life with everyone. I see, Milam said after a few moments of silence. She turned away and looked to be contemplating something. That sounds really amazing, she said in a distant voice filled with some new emotion Rimuru wasn't quite sure where to place. I wonder. She began saying something, but stopped and shook her head as if trying to get whatever she was thinking out. Milam? He asked in worry, but she looked over and continued to smile. No, it's nothing, She hastily said, "Just some dumb thoughts I had. Hee, don't mind me. Anyways," she said a little too loudly as she got up, "let's get dinner." She began dragging him along by the arm, and he didn't resist. He wondered just what she was thinking, but decided not to pry for now. He was sure that, whatever it was, she would come clean eventually.
Winter in the Jura forest was indeed short. The 2 weeks or so of snow was, apparently, quite a long time for the region, but even that eventually came to an end as warmer days came. The snow began to melt and much of the land began to recover its green hue. It would soon be spring, a perfect time to celebrate new life and new opportunities. Thus, Tempest was preparing for yet another celebration, this one a little more pragmatic.
When the city first started out, they had quite the housing issues. For that reason, most ended up sleeping in common dormitories separated by gender, but as time passed and actual houses for single families became available, the question arose: how to parcel these houses? Rimuru came up with the idea to hold a confession day every month, in which couples would come together and those who decided to start a family though not marry, as most monsters had no such customs, would be allocated a house depending on how available they were. Over time, as more houses were built and the number of new couples dwindled, Confession Day was moved away from a monthly event to being held every 4 months only. And as it happens, one such day was to be held soon. Rimuru was quite excited about it, as the once simple celebration had evolved quite a bit since its inception and was now a full blow party with music, dance and of course food. The monsters, due to influences from the humans adventurers passing through, even decided to start holding official marriage ceremonies to make everything seem more civilized. Of course, most, especially the older ones, didn't really care and simply continued with the old traditions.
The reason Rimuru was exited was simple: he was going to take Milam to a date to the celebration. While they had dinner in his house occasionally, and spent some time together having fun with this or that, he realized they never actually had a proper date yet.
That was a huge bummer for him, who, as stated before, was a huge fan of clichés. Confession Day would thus be an excellent opportunity for a date, even if it turned out not all that different from what they usually did. As long as they had fun it would be worth it, he reasoned. Of course, Milam was beyond excited when she heard, running off to Shuna for a new outfit to wear, though he yelled after her not to go too crazy. He himself decided to just wear a simple blue hoodie and white, loose pants. As the sun set, preparations for the party were finalized, with only a few people around. Rimuru sat near the entrance, watching a group of hobgoblins as they prepared their simple instruments to play music. Sadly, he had yet to find anything better than handmade drums, pipes and simple string instruments, and reproducing any from his past life proved too difficult for the simple reason that he had no real idea how more complex instruments worked. Even Great Sage was of little help, as it could only reproduce things it had observed firsthand. His poor memories, at best, were not nearly enough, it informed him. Even so, the hobgoblins proved quite adept at making do with what they had, and a number of them even began working on developing stuff by themselves. It would take times, perhaps years of research, but he figured that was probably better than just giving it to them on a silver platter. As he looked at the group rehearsing, he was distracted by a pair of fast-approaching footsteps. He turned around and was once again taken aback, his non-existing heart skipping a beat as he saw Milam coming over in a simple, red summer dress. Her hair was loose and she looked as excited as always with a wide, bright smile. She stopped just short of him and quickly asked, "How's this?" While doing a little twirl, he smiled and took her hand in his. "You look great. As usual," he said and began leading her into the temporary open tent that dominated the square. Looking at her, he decided that he could hardly wait any longer and signaled to the hobgoblin to start playing something. With wry smiles on their faces, the musicians began playing a soft tune. "It's starting already?" Milam asked as they stopped in the middle of the dance area, looking around a bit confused. He drew her closer and placed one hand behind her back. "I can't be bothered to wait," he told her with a smile, "so let's have some fun," and began leading her along in a slow dance. I'm not good at this," Milam confessed a bit embarrassed. Rimuru continued to lead the impromptu dance, and he quickly realized that she was just mimicking him. "Well, just keep following my steps, okay?" She nodded. They continued to slowly twirl around the dance area. At some point, she buried her face in his shoulder. He noticed that a small crowd gathered around the entrance of the tent, politely watching in silence. He paid no attention to their grins, continuing to lead the girl as they fooled around the dance floor.
Pretty soon, the celebration was in full swing as dozens of couples began dancing and partying, but for the most part Rimuru and Milim ignored them, lost in each other's company. After a few hours of dancing and eating and even a few marriage ceremonies which Milim seemed to find really fun, the party began to die down. Even as everyone but the designated cleaning crew were left, Rimuru and Milim remained, still caught up in their date. Eventually, he decided they really should leave, and began making their way through the city, hand in hand. Milim woke up with a sudden jolt, the images from the bad dream still fresh. Looking around the dark room, she noticed that Rimuru was not around, then remembered they parted ways some time after the celebration ended. Slowly, she threw the covers away, and got out of the bed and moved to the window. She had to stare for a while when she saw her reflection, a small grimace still hanging on her face along with some light sweat. She tried to remember when was the last time anything made her sweat, but could it? The though, however, made her recall some parts of the dream, in which she once again could do nothing but look on in terror as someone else she cared for was killed and all she could do was avenge them, instead of protecting them. With fists balled, she slowly but quietly made her way outside, hoping the cool air would calm her mind a bit. She wandered around for a while, not having any particular destination in mind, and paid heed to the curious gaze of the occasional night guard. Eventually, she realized she unconsciously made her way over to the large clearing she had first landed and met Rimuru. She looked intently to the spot they had fought. The crater had long since been covered up by some workers, but the patch of missing grass still gave it away. Her mind drifted back to the day she first saw him, in Clayman's crystal globe. The though of the other demon lord made Hugh scowl deeper. She was sure the small fry was up to something, but for the life of her she just could not figure out what.
She had no real proof, of course. Even she realized that just killing the idiot outright with no actual proof would just cause more trouble. If not for her, then it may just cause more grief for Rimuru if the other demon lords, especially Guy, found out she did it to keep him safe from whatever Clayman was doing. If she wasn't careful, the others might think he was using her or something and then things would really get out of hand. Plus, he had already said he wasn't interested in becoming a demon lord or tangle with them. His diplomatic relations with Carrion aside.
Even so, she knew that Clayman was up to something. If not him, then someone else was using him. She would eventually need to do something, she had to. There was no way she would allow that dream to come true. However, she was at a loss, racking her brain on what the best course of action was. She began pacing, losing track of time. Before she knew it, it was dawn. As she stared at the rising sun, she sensed a familiar presence coming in from behind. Smiling, she turned to Rimuru. "You weren't in your room," he said as he approached. He had a worried look in his eyes. "Is everything all right?" "The night guards said they saw around the city last night." "It's fine," she half lied. She disliked it, but disliked seeing Rimuru worried even more, so she swallowed her dislikes as best she could. "I just had a bad bread," she muttered while looking away. Rimuru looked at her for a brief moment before suddenly pulling her into a hug, which she quickly returned. "Do you want to talk about it?" she heard Rimuru ask softly. When she shook her head, he continued, "Are you sure?" "I'll listen to anything you have to say, you know." "It's okay," she murmured. "It was just a dumb dream." She pulled back and smiled. "It's fine now." He looked a bit unconvinced, but nodded anyway and returned the smile. Putting a hand around her shoulder, he began leading her away from the clearing. "Well, if you ever change your mind," he offered. Deep inside, her heart melted at his considerate words. Not saying anything, the two made their way to the dining hall for breakfast. Along the way, she had made up her mind. One way or another, she would do her best to keep her Rimuru safe. She would do whatever it took.